All right, everybody. We're going to get started now as folks continue to join, and I'm sure folks will continue to as I give a brief introduction. But welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Knight. I am a manager with the Lenfest Ocean Program. For those of you that don't know us, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds scientific research projects and expert working groups to address the priority science needs facing ocean and coastal decision makers. To learn more about us and the many projects we have funded, visit us at lenfestocean.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us at Lenfest Ocean on Twitter. And we are also on Facebook at Lenfest Ocean. So feel free to follow us there. So for today's agenda, we have Dr. Charles Greene, a senior fellow at Ocean Visions and professor at Cornell University. Dr. Erin Meyer-Gutbrod, an assistant professor at University of South Carolina, and Dr. Kimberley Davies, an associate professor at the University of New Brunswick. They are going to talk about a new paper they have in oceanography on how climate-driven ocean changes further threaten North Atlantic right whales. And I am going to drop a link to the paper in the chat right now, as well as a link to a fact sheet that we developed about the paper if you just want to look at the main messages. Okay, there we go. So I will let the researchers get into the details of the paper, but from Lenfest's perspective, we felt funding this research was extremely important because we recognize that changing ocean conditions is likely to make difficult issues like protecting North Atlantic right whales from ship strikes and gear entanglements in the northwestern Atlantic even more challenging. And in that vein, I want to acknowledge what a difficult and frankly controversial issue this is, for the species, for managers and policymakers, as well as for stakeholders. Our hope is that by better understanding what happened in the 2010s when conditions in the Gulf of Maine and the Western Scotian Shelf began more rapidly warming, we can help shed light on how environmental conditions shape the food web and ultimately the feeding conditions for right whales and their reproductive capacity. We hope this study is a building block in helping managers and policymakers better anticipate and develop actions in the long run that can keep pace with the rate of change. So some webinar logistics. We have all our attendees muted with so many people on the line. It's just to prevent feedback or echoes. To ask a question, we will have the researchers do their full presentation and then answer questions at the end. To submit a question, use the Q&A panel to type and submit it. I will read it aloud at the end for the researchers to answer. And you can submit that at any point during the presentation and I will manage the queue. I do ask that people try to use the Q&A panel for questions because to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A can be a little bit difficult and I don't want to miss any. But if you put something in the chat, we'll see that too. As for questions, while we are absolutely able to take questions about how this research is relevant to management and policy, we do ask that folks stick to the scope of the project. That is our area of expertise, and we trust your best judgment in doing that after you hear the presentation. If a question comes that is beyond our scope, we may not be able to answer it, but we will certainly do the best we can. Depending on how many questions there are, we may not get to them all, but we welcome folks following up with us. You can see my email at the bottom, and we will have a slide at the end that has everybody's contact. And lastly, we are recording this webinar, so we will send out the link as soon as we have it. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Charles Greene.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Well, I first became interested in studying North Atlantic right whales back in 2000 when I realized how sensitive the species was, especially its calving rates, to oceanographic conditions. Next slide, please. Next one. So this realization led to new research focus in my lab group on the conservation oceanography of the North Atlantic right whale. Andy Pershing was a graduate student in our lab at the time, and he and I had been studying the impacts of natural climate variability and anthropogenic climate change on Northwest Atlantic ecosystems, especially in the Gulf of Maine. Next slide, please. Now, the Gulf of Maine lies within an oceanographic transition zone that's strongly influenced by two large current systems. First, we have the Labrador Current bringing in colder and less saline water from the north, and then the Gulf Stream bringing up warmer and more saline water from the south. In 2003 and 2004, Andy and I published our first modeling studies on North Atlantic right whale calving rates, demonstrating how tightly coupled they were to the abundance of their primary prey, the copepod species Calanus finmarchicus. Andy moved on to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute after finishing up at Cornell, where he went on to inspire the research of a number of other young scientists on right whale conservation oceanography. My lab group has continued this work for the past 2 decades with Dr. Erin Meyer-Gutbrod, then a graduate student, picking up and advancing the population modeling studies that Andy and I had begun. Next slide, please. What we had found was that between 1980 and 2009, there were ecosystem regime shifts every decade in the Gulf of Maine, and these were triggered by salinity anomalies that were remotely forced by changes in the Arctic climate system. And that figure that you see in the lower left-hand portion of the screen shows you the interconnections between the circulation in the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic. And as you can see, as you move further downstream, you can see the Gulf of Maine down there. And what we're looking at on the right-hand side is that we're basically showing how you could track when you had the export of fresh water from the Arctic into the North Atlantic, we could actually track these salinity anomalies coming down. And it takes a couple of years for them basically to reach the Gulf of Maine. Now, that was the way things were up until 2009. And then 2010 came along and the oceanography changed dramatically. Next slide, please. What we see on the left-hand side of your screen is the North Atlantic, and specifically the North Atlantic component of the meridional overturning circulation. So I'm just going to refer to it as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. Now, the AMOC is the Atlantic component of a global ocean conveyor belt that begins with deep water formation in the Northeast Atlantic, and that's shown in blue on this slide. And then basically that conveyor belt or ocean circulation is driven by temperature and salinity differences throughout the far reaches of the Indian, Southern, and Pacific Oceans before returning to the North Atlantic, and that's shown in the orange on this figure. Now, increasing evidence during the last couple of decades suggests that anthropogenic climate change has been slowing down the AMOC for the past 50 years. Now, the Gulf Stream sits at the tail end of this conveyor belt. And since 2010, if we look over at Part B, the trajectory of the Gulf Stream has shifted. Basically, what we've seen is relative to the prior decade in 2000 to 2009, the Gulf Stream's slowing has resulted in its meandering starting further to the west, closer to the continental shelf, and its north wall shifting further to the north. As a consequence, the Gulf Stream's been contributing more of its warmer and saltier water to the slope waters, which are shown in red on this figure. Those slope waters then enter the deep basins of the Gulf of Maine and the Western Scotian Shelf. Note that unlike other heat waves that have been reported around the global ocean, this particular heat wave is being generated by heat entering the Gulf of Maine and the Western Scotian Shelf from below rather than through surface heating. This heating from below has warmed the Gulf of Maine more rapidly than 99% of the global ocean and has resulted in a regime shift strongly impacting these shelf ecosystems and their living resources. One consequence of this ecosystem regime shift has been that the North Atlantic right whale population largely has abandoned its foraging grounds in the Bay of Fundy in the eastern Gulf of Maine during summer and has moved northward into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Erin will now describe to you what the consequences have been for right whales.
Thanks. Emily, you can advance to the next slide. So thanks, Chuck. This time series here shows some of the underlying data that describes the oceanographic processes that Chuck was referring to. So this time series runs from 1980 to 2020, and the top figure is the Gulf Stream Index. Now that's an EOF, an empirical orthogonal function analysis, that essentially characterized the position of the north wall of the Gulf Stream. And in years when it's red, that means that the Gulf Stream is farther north and closer to the Gulf of Maine than in years when it's blue. And so you can see from this index time series that the Gulf Stream entered this regime of being farther north than it has been in the previous decades. There's actually a really nice paper that was published at the same time as ours by Dan Sadov, and I'd recommend taking a look at that because it provides a lot of great detail about this shift in the Gulf Stream north wall and the extension zone and how that's contributed to warming in and around the Gulf of Maine and Scotian Shelf. So looking down to the second time series from the top, over that same period, we're looking at the regional slope water temperature index. Now, this is the temperature of the deep waters, somewhere between 150 and 200 meters, at a series of 8 different regions around the basins in the mouth of the Gulf of Maine and along the Western Scotian Shelf. And all these data have been collapsed using a principal components analysis. And so in years when those bars are red and the anomaly is high, then that means that the water is warmer than it has been in the past. And then blue bars indicate that that deep slope water is colder. So in conjunction with this shift in the Gulf Stream, moving farther north, we see a warming in those deep waters around the mouth of the Gulf of Maine. So this second figure is really compelling to show that warming that Chuck was describing. This warming is happening from below. Then if we advance to the third figure in the time series, this is what we're so grateful to LenFest funding for. LenFest provided the money needed to analyze Calanus finmarchicus samples collected by the continuous plankton recorder. So this is a really long-running monitoring program that crosses the Gulf of Maine and has told us the story of a lot of these regime shifts in previous decades. But unfortunately, the processing of sampling stopped around 2011. And so with LenFest funding, we were able to catch up another 5 years and see how these oceanographic shifts impacted the abundance of Calanus in the Gulf of Maine. So Calanus, of course, is right whale's primary prey group. And where the Calanus is often where the right whales are. So you can see in conjunction with this shift in the Gulf Stream that started in 2010 and that warming of those deep basins in the Gulf of Maine and on the Scotian Shelf, there's this corresponding decline in late stage Calanus finmarchicus. Now that time series that you're seeing, that third time series, is showing the anomaly of Calanus during the summer months. So specifically over July, August, and September. And we chose to visualize those months because they correspond with this shift that we've seen in right whale distribution. That's the most obvious time of the year where right whales have been using habitat differently than they have in the previous decade. And so this data, now that we've processed this Calanus data, it's a compelling argument that it's actually the change in prey abundance that motivated this shift in habitat use by right whales. Finally, in the fourth figure in this time series, we're looking at a right whale calving index. So that's the number of calves born each year divided by the number of females that are available to reproduce. And we do it this way because not every female can reproduce each year. If they were pregnant the year before, for example, they're busy lactating. So it happens at best on a 3-year cycle. And by dividing the number of calves born by the number of females available, we can really get to a specific annual reproductive efficiency proxy. So you can see here in 2010, when the Calanus finmarchicus declined, we saw a corresponding decline in right whale reproduction efficiency. We've seen fewer calf births since 2010 than we had in the previous decade. And of course, if you're looking carefully at these time series, we saw a similar trend in the 1990s, and that's what we've published on previously, was that decline in Calanus finmarchicus in the 90s corresponded with this decline in right whale reproduction. The oceanography of it was slightly different, but the prey and the calving in this system are really tightly linked. Emily, you can advance to the next slide. So the previous slide is all about how right whale reproduction changed in response to these oceanographic changes. And this slide is how right whale distribution has changed in conjunction with these new oceanographic processes. So we see 8 maps here. It's a lot to go through, but the first row corresponds to the first quarter, so January, February, March. The second row of maps corresponds to the second quarter, April, May, June. The third row corresponds to the third quarter of the year, July, August, September. And then the fourth row is the fourth quarter of the year, October, November, December. So we've got this seasonal breakdown sort of along the vertical axis. And then if you look, the panels on the left side correspond to right whale distribution in the decade from 2000 to 2009. And the panels on the right side correspond to the more recent decade from 2010 to 2019. So if you let your eye go down the column from 2 decades ago, from the 2000s, you can see what we have come to think of as sort of the traditional right whale habitat use in sort of the modern era. And what we typically would see would be right whales are using Cape Cod Bay and the Great South Channel in the winter and spring. And then in the summer, right whales move up to the Bay of Fundy and out to Roseway Basin and feed there in the summer and the fall. In the deep winter, there's not a lot of monitoring, so it is actually a big question where right whales spend most of their time. But so that's sort of the traditional pattern that we have expected right whales to take. Now, if you look over at the right-hand column, this shows some of the distribution shifts that have happened in this most recent decade. And in places where right whale icons are green, blue or green, I'm not sure what you guys are seeing, but those green right whales are places where right whale abundance, their sightings per unit of effort increased relative to the previous decade. And in areas where the little right whale icons are red are areas where right whale sightings have decreased relative to the previous decade. So looking now at that full column, we can see at the top that right whales have been using the Cape Cod Bay more than they have in the previous decade. However, when you move down to the third quarter into those late summer, early fall months, we see that right whales are using the Bay of Fundy and the Roseway Basin on the Scotian Shelf much less than they have been in the previous decade. And of course, I would assume many of you know the story of right whales using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and that's shown up at the top. We've got this new influx of whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence during those summer and fall months. So this oceanographic regime that has impacted right whale prey is now changing how right whales are feeding and reproducing, and it's changing how they're using their habitat. Go ahead, you can advance to the next slide. Now this kind of sums up the story that we've gotten from all the slides previously. And again, in these two infographics on the left, we're seeing conditions from the decade from 2000 to 2009. And on the right, we're seeing the more recent decade from 2010 to 2019. So on the left, 2 decades ago, those deep waters of the Gulf of Maine and the Scotian Shelf were relatively cool, and there was a high amount of prey abundance, late-stage Calanus finmarchicus, for right whales to eat. And because prey was good, right whale reproductive efficiency was high. There were many calves born each year. Also, because right whales were behaving in the ways that we expect, the policies that we put in place to reduce fishing gear entanglement and vessel strikes were doing, I don't want to say they were doing a great job, but they were doing the job that governments were expecting them to do, right? We were getting something like 3 or 4 carcasses discovered in a given year. And most of those were on account of these human-caused mortalities. So that's sort of the system that we were getting used to. But then in 2010, with this oceanographic regime shift, we had warming in those deep basins and a corresponding decline in right whale food. And that, of course, triggered fewer births. When right whales don't have enough food to eat, they don't have the energy required to reproduce. Then, as they shift habitat into unexpected habitats, we don't have policies in place to protect them from vessel strikes and fishing gear entanglement. So this oceanographic regime shift really impacted right whales in 2 different ways. One, this direct decline in prey caused a decline in births. And then 2, the more indirect change in their behavior made our policies less effective. Go ahead, Emily, to the next slide, please. Okay, and this infographic was published in our paper. It tells the story that we've just told, again, where the left side is 2 decades ago and the right side is the most recent decade. And, you know, the infographic at the top kind of goes through the physical oceanographic conditions that have driven this change. But I want you to pay attention now to the time series in the middle. Here we're looking at just the past 2 decades, from 2000 to 2019. And the green bars show the number of calves born during each year of this time series. So of course, in the 2000s, there was a good number of calves born each year. And then in the 2010s, there have been fewer calf births. Now the red bars are the number of carcasses discovered. And you can see through most of the time series, that number that I quoted of about 3 or 4 carcasses in a given year persists up through about 2016. But then in 2017, when those right whales started to be found in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we had that policy mismatch and the increased sighting of carcasses. And of course, 2017 started what has been declared an unexpected mortality event. So zooming out even further, when you look at this time series, what you should see is we've gotten both a decline in births and a decrease, and an increase in mortality. And of course, any population with fewer inputs and more output is going to create a population decline. Finally, at the bottom of this figure, we see these bars, green, yellow, and red. And these correspond to a demographic analysis tied to a mark recapture model that essentially is just looking at how are right whales going to fare in the future if the conditions that we've seen in the present time period persist. So early in the 2000s, when births were high and deaths were relatively low, the population was expected to double in the next 20 or so years. Okay, so there was a good amount of growth happening in the population. And then, of course, in the most recent years, from 2017 to 2019, that decline in births and the increase in mortalities has caused the population to decline towards extinction. And the model actually predicts that the species could go extinct in less than a century, less than 100 years, if the conditions from the past few years persist. Go ahead, next slide. And I think it's time to pass it off to Dr. Kim Davies.
Okay, thanks, Erin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so right whales, as Erin explained, shifted their distribution quite abruptly. And that distributional shift was associated in time with a sort of decadal scale decline in population size, as well as declines in population health. And so looking forward, you know, conservation efforts are going to focus on trying to reverse the current decline and increase the population size and improve the health of the species. Part of that process needs to be to help try to break that cycle in red. That means to prevent excess mortalities when distributional shifts occur. So 2 years stand out over the past 10 years when excess mortalities occurred. Those were 2017 and 2019 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, when there were a high number of mortalities that occurred in the new foraging habitat. And those mortalities occurred as we were conducting science in that area, as conservation efforts were ramping up, as stewardship and management efforts were ramping up, and so sort of our lack of knowledge or our inability to be really nimble to these changes in distribution was a contributing factor to those excess mortalities. So looking forward, we need to have science efforts, stewardship on the water, rescue efforts, management and policy efforts that are responsive to changing ocean conditions, because right whale prey is sensitive to changes in oceanography. It's sensitive to temperature. It's sensitive to processes that affect the sources and sinks and transport of water from one area to another. And so these changing conditions means that North Atlantic right whales are going to continue to surprise us. They may not stay in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They may move to other areas following changes in oceanography that affect the distribution of their food. And so we need all of these efforts. We need the science, the management, the stewardship, and we need collaboration and participation of all the actors that are involved in all of these different efforts. And that's extremely important. I am going to focus on the next couple of slides on the science, and especially some of the science that's coming out of the oceanographic community, because this is most closely related to the topic of our paper, but nonetheless want to acknowledge that this is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. So science to help now. In Canada, I'm Canadian, so I'll focus a little bit on what's been happening in Canada. The Canadian landscape of policy and management and science has been changing in leaps and bounds in response to these excess mortality events. And the reason that we've been able to make quite a lot of progress over the last couple of years is because of the 40 years of research and data that has allowed us to get to the point where we're able to explain the processes that are affecting the animals, track their distribution, and track the consequences of these changes. So the reason why we are have been able to do something is because there's been a continuous science that's been going on for decades, and you saw some of that data in our paper. So a continuation of long-term time series is going to be critical to future conservation efforts, but at the same time, we are and need to be incorporating technological and ideological advancements. And those advancements are going to be important in helping us to anticipate and adapt to further changes in right whale distribution. So some of the important efforts that are going on, and there are a lot of them. So this, I'm sorry if I'm leaving anyone out here, but I'm just going to be quite focused here on whale detection for a little bit. So there's been a lot of advancement in both visual and acoustic detection and monitoring of North Atlantic right whales across their range, and including in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And a lot of these efforts are now able to provide real-time data on the presence and absence of whales, as well as some of the ocean conditions that they're foraging in and that they're using. And these data are being used not only to contribute to continuing these long time series of data, but also used in a real-time context to support dynamic management and help to mitigate human activities when and where right whales are actually located. So, slide. So this is just an example of some data from the last 2 weeks in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So on the left is a map showing 2 weeks of visual and acoustic surveillance and detections. The red and yellow are acoustic detections, and the gray are visual detections, primarily from aerial surveillance. So you can see that there's quite a lot of monitoring that is happening in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Planes in the air. There are vessel-based surveys out of Mingan Island, as well as out of Shippagan and other areas. And there, to this arsenal of monitoring tools, we've added gliders. So my group has got 2 gliders in the water right now in shipping lanes, and there are there's other groups in Canada and the US that are using gliders to detect whales, as well as collect oceanographic information on that will help explain the variation in whale distribution. There are also passive acoustic monitoring buoys on this figure. Again, there are Canadian and US efforts to do this on both sides of the border to provide sort of sentinels that can detect temporal variation in the presence of these animals in critical areas. And these detections are being used on both sides of the border to support various dynamic management efforts to help to mitigate human activities. Slide. Okay, so while these new kinds of assets that are coming out of the oceanographic community are really important for supplementing these long-term data sets, we need to also continue with these long-term time series that are helping us to monitor the impacts of climate change on the prey resource of right whales, because some of these time series have now been implemented for several decades, and we're just now able to begin to assess decadal scale variability, which is sort of the scale at which climate impacts can really be quantified. So there's some planktonic time series that are really important, the ECOMON series in the Gulf of Maine, the Continuous Plankton Recorder Survey, and on the Canadian side of the border, the Atlantic Zone Monitoring Program. So these are really important time series that we've used in our studies and have been used in a lot of studies of right whale prey in the last few years. And so we need to continue with those to continue to be able to explain variation in right whale distribution. At the same time, there are also long-term monitoring programs for the whales themselves. There are visual monitoring programs. The Bay of Fundy monitoring program is one. There's monitoring programs throughout the US and Canada that really need to be continued so that we can be very nimble and anticipate change. Okay, slide. So I can't recall, was I going to do this one? I'll just do this one and then I'll hand it back over. We are working on, just to follow up, this is sort of the end of the content of our first manuscript, and we are working on a second data-driven manuscript to study more fine-scale habitat use between decades and look at changes in the sort of migration climatology of these animals, and including new sources of data, especially those from Canadian waters that have emerged as being really important. So you can look for that paper coming out within the next few months. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Erin and Chuck. Thank you so much for that presentation. And so that's kind of the end of the presentation, especially of the first paper. And as you heard, a second paper is coming. And so we welcome your questions in the Q&A. I know we have an initial question about whether or not more funding has been secured to continue processing the CPR data. And I think yes. I think the answer is yes. I know that continued funding has been secured to collect the CPR data, and I know there are folks from NOAA on the webinar. So if any one of them wants to enter into the chat or anything, what the status of CPR is. Otherwise, I'll just pause here in case Chuck, Erin, Kim, you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, from my understanding, the CPR is getting back in the water and there's funding secured to collect the samples at least for the next few years. But I don't believe that right now there's a long-term strategy in place to fund the CPR, which means that every few years it's this new battle and there's this new risk of the time series being dropped for a while. And I'll say that when you're interested in climate change specifically, or any sort of process that happens across many decades, it is so important to have consistent and ideally not interrupted time series so that you can examine these changes that are happening in the oceanography and in the ecosystem. So, you know, if you want something to do, write to your Congress people and say, fund the CPR. You know, let's keep these long-term monitoring programs well funded so that we can do the climate science that we need to do that is a really important part of the conservation of these species.
Thank you, Erin. Oh, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I'd like to just step in and add a few comments to that as well. Basically, the lack of funding, you know, a congressional funding to NOAA forced them to make the decision to stop processing the samples. And and it couldn't have happened at a worse time. The changes in the Gulf of Maine during the decade of 2010 to 2019 was as dramatic as anything that has historically uh, been observed there. And we know that this has impacted the cod population there. It's impacted right whales. And here we are, 10 years after events started happening very quickly, explaining what happened, but we're doing it sort of in a forensic way. Whereas if we had had these time series continued, if we'd had the samples processed, um, we would have been able to know what was going on much more quickly. So it's really, I can't even begin to emphasize how important these time series are to enable us to respond more dynamically and not just put together the story really way after the fact.
Yeah, and actually that dovetails with a question I'm seeing in the chat, which says, A, thank you for a very clear and compelling presentation. Do you feel there is adequate science, real-time data to support effective dynamic management? Because it doesn't seem that issuing updated regulations every 7 years, which is how long it took for the US to issue its latest update, are going to cut it anymore in the face of these changes. And do you think that adjustments every year would be the appropriate time frame given the available science?
I guess I'll tackle that one first. I think that we should try to update as quickly as we can. It does take time to analyze these or to process these plankton samples. So we're not getting these results in real time. It's going to take a few months to get those. One of the nice things, though, is that we do have the physical oceanographic data coming in more quickly, so that we can at least be able to respond or recognize these changes occurring uh, closer to real time. So yes, I would say that the possibility there is to at least know within a year that dramatic changes are underway. So I think we can begin to um, respond, and if nothing else, it tells us that we need to enhance our monitoring. If we see dramatic changes occurring in the physical oceanography, that means we should be on the lookout. And I know that there were a lot of even before 2017, when all of the whales were killed in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there was a lot of um, speculation in the community as to what was going on. Why were the calving rates of right whales dropping? And we should have been able to figure that one out if we had had our plankton samples processed. There's no reason why we should have been in 2019 still uh, in the dark as to what was going on.
Yeah, I can add to that a bit. And it's, of course, kind of a loaded question, but I think that Canada has done a really nice job of implementing these dynamic policies, right? And Kim can talk about those at length, but broadly, there's a lot of monitoring in place, including Kim's Slocum gliders listening for right whale calls. And there are rules such that if a call is heard, then a certain area is shut down. If a second call is heard, then that area is shut down for a longer period of time. And that will cause fishermen to pull fishing gear out of the water in response to new habitat usage by these animals. And similar things are happening with vessels and speed reduction policies. So I think that Canada has created a really nice model that it would be great if the US could take some of those policies and implement them here. But that's not really a perfect solution, and there's a few reasons why. But most of it has to do with our overall uncertainty about where right whales are. We need more monitoring, right? And acoustic monitoring is fabulous. That's a great way to put instruments in place that are listening for right whales around the clock and don't need humans on the water or flying in airplanes. So acoustic monitoring is great, but right whales aren't always making calls, right? So it's not a perfect solution. And of course, humans can't be surveying visually the North Atlantic all day, every day. It's just impossible. So that's sort of the other side of the scenario, is sometimes having a consistent policy in place that's broad and perhaps more than you want to overshoot it, right? You don't want to undershoot it. So if you have a broad policy saying any vessel in this area over the next 6 months has to slow down to 10 knots, then there's not so much concern about missing where right whales are going, because we do miss a lot of them. So I don't think there's any one answer, but we have to think creatively, and we just have to broaden our monitoring efforts so that we can observe real-time changes in the timing of their habitat use, and really importantly, so we can uncover new habitats that right whales may have been using for decades, but we just don't know about it. Or perhaps new habitats that are just now being used in response to these changing oceanographic conditions.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Erin said. Thanks very much for that, Erin. I'll just add that in the Canadian context, so there have been a lot of mitigation measures implemented in the last several years, and sort of those have been evolving and changing. And so it is too early, I think, to say, what's been effective and what hasn't, and how effective dynamic management has been, and what the sort of consequences are or have been on the communities that use the region. But I think Erin hit the nail on the head when she said that the real-time monitoring allows us to be nimble to changes in right whale distribution. If all of a sudden right whales didn't show up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence next year and they went off Newfoundland instead, I think we would find them. And whereas when right whales began to decline in the Bay of Fundy starting in 2010, we went 5 years without knowing where they were, at least during the time of year when they're in Canadian waters. So I think that that's a really important advancement in terms of the monitoring of the animals. But again, I'll just say I think it's a little bit early to sort of know if what we've been doing up in Canada is really enough to protect them.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And it's actually really, it's great to kind of hear you guys share your different perspectives on this between the two countries too, because this is a really tough issue, and I feel like we're in a time of kind of great change. We have another question here. Only half the catalog right whale population uses the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Any comments on strategies to locate the other half of the population in the summer months?
I can
go ahead.
I can take that one. So right whales are concentrated in the Gulf of St. Lawrence during the summer, but it's not the only habitat that they're currently using during the summer months. And our next paper, our second paper that's coming out, is going to dive into that problem a little more deeply, because there are areas, for example, around Nantucket Shoals and south of Cape Cod, where they seem to be increasing. And then there are also areas that are underexplored, which include areas around, in Newfoundland, Eastern Scotian Shelf, and in sort of the north eastern portion of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So in terms of strategies to explore some of these areas, I had a master's student, Delphine Durette-Marin, who just finished a paper that analyzed data from acoustic moorings that were deployed throughout Canadian waters by a number of different groups, from Bay of Fundy all the way up to the Labrador Sea, from 2015 to 2017. And what she found was that the population is primarily concentrated south of Newfoundland, essentially. So if we take that information as sort of a first approximation of where we should look, I believe that we should probably expand our monitoring south of Newfoundland to see if there are potentially other habitats out there that may be underexplored. And the other problem, I guess, and this isn't really a solution, but it's a problem. So I've had a glider in the Cabot Strait for the last couple of months. And we believe that right whales, that's the primary migratory corridor that right whales use to get in and out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And yet we haven't had any real-time detections of right whales. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no detections of right whales on the glider, because we know that the misdetection rate in real time can at times be quite high when whale densities are low. But it does suggest the possibility that in some of these areas that we might want to explore, we may have a problem doing that when the whales are diffusely distributed. So if the whales are moving around a lot, we may have we may need to start thinking outside the box in terms of finding the other half of the population if they're distributed among a lot of different smaller habitats.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. That was great. I'll just add a little bit to that. So I've been working with Leah Crow some recently, and she's got a great paper that should be coming out any week now that really dives into detail on the population that has been using the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And it seems that it's about a third of the population is using that habitat, and where the other animals are going is largely unknown. So it's absolutely a massive problem that can only be solved with extensive monitoring efforts. And we're talking monitoring efforts that get much more difficult as you get farther away from populated zones where scientists have access to. But the thing I'll add, because it seems like such a horrible and scary problem to figure out where these right whales are going, something that comforts me is that wherever they're going, if they're far from humans, if they're far from most commercial fishing gear and really high concentrations of vessels, then it's not quite as important that we know where those habitats are. So that's what allows me to sleep at night, is while our monitoring is biased to be concentrated where people are, that is also the places that need to be monitored the most. So just a little beacon of hope for you.
Thanks.
I'd like to put in a comment on this as well. Emily, can you move us back to the slide that shows the distribution of whales, how they changed over the 2 decades?
Okay, here we go. Hold on a second. You thinking this one or the?
Oh, keep going.
Yeah.
Keep going. There we go. Yeah. Whoops. One too far. Can you go? Can you move forward?
There you go.
Yeah. So one of the things I just wanted to point out here, because the question was, where are the whales that aren't going to the Gulf of St. Lawrence? And I just want to point out, we emphasize what was going on really in Canadian waters in this particular paper, but I want to sort of direct people's attention to what happened in the first quarter and the second quarter in Cape Cod Bay. And you can see that there is actually, in the winter and the spring, there's a pretty large increase in right whale use in those areas. And you can also see in the fourth quarter, in the autumn, that there's an increase. So, you know, if Erin's comments were soothing, my concern is that we are seeing not only right whales going up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where they were initially impacted very heavily, but now the Canadian response is reducing that impact. We're also seeing them moving into Cape Cod Bay. There's also the area in the mid-Atlantic Bight to the south of Vineyard Sound that Kim mentioned earlier, where we also were seeing increases. So these are areas where you know, they're relatively shallow waters. There's the potential for greater impacts with fisheries. And they're also in areas where they're in major shipping channels along the east coast of the US. So, you know, this is not just a Canadian problem. We focused on that because of the changes that we saw up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in this paper, but this is an American problem as well.
Thanks for that. And actually, have you all noticed distribution shifts for other baleen whales in the Gulf of Maine?
I haven't really been looking at data for that.
Okay, fair enough. There we go. Okay, just keeping up with the questions. Thanks for the great presentation. Just wondering what the knowledge is of the comparative foraging behavior and energy acquisition of right whales that resided in the Bay of Fundy in earlier years and those in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in recent years, such as abundance, body size, energy content of late stage Cephin marcicus and other Calanus species.
Yeah, that's a great question. That go ahead, Kim. Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah. So this is an area of active research, and there are several groups that are working on this, including my group. So I think one of the major factors in this in this topic area is this idea that right whales are in the Bay of Fundy are feeding primarily on Calanus fimarchicus, whereas those in the Gulf of St. Lawrence are feeding on a mix of Calanus fimarchicus and its larger and proportionally more energy-rich cousin, Calanus hyperboreus, which is a more sort of Arctic, subarctic species. It's a colder water species, so we don't generally find it in any great abundance in the Bay of Fundy or in the Gulf of Maine. And so in terms of energy acquisition, it is thought that the Calanus hyperboreus in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence is playing a very significant role in the amount of prey energy that's actually in the water column, and perhaps supplementing in a very substantial way the energy that they would get from Calanus fimarchicus. I've been out in the Bay of Fundy for the last couple of years in the right whale critical habitat out there doing some oceanographic studies, and there still is Calanus fimarchicus there, not in any great abundance, but there are still sort of deep layers of energy-rich Calanus there. But I think what the issue is that that right whales require such high density concentrations of Calanus that there's just not enough there for them to want to stay. And so they're up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the oceanographic conditions up there are quite different than in the Bay of Fundy, and the bathymetric conditions as well. It's a shallower habitat, so the prey the diapausing prey anywhere are available at shallower depths. and so these are all sort of different observations that have been made in recent years that will likely help us to answer the question of why right whales are in the Gulf of St. Lawrence as opposed to the Bay of Fundy, and whether or not they are food limited in the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
Great, and we are at 2 o'clock, and so I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank Chuck, Erin, and Kim for a really great presentation. This has been recorded, and we will be sending the link out. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us today and for all of your great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great questions.